in the heart of a storm-ravaged land, where the winds howl like grieving spirits, and the rain falls in unrelenting sheets, a young elemental mage named Kale stumbled upon something that would change everything. Beneath the crumbling ruins of his village, hidden beneath layers of ash and time, lay an ancient relic, a jagged shard of stone that pulsed faintly with a light that seemed to breathe. It called to him, not with words, but with a hum that resonated deep in his bones, a sound that spoke of power long forgotten. This relic belonged to the Stormbound, an order of mages who once commanded the elements themselves. But legends warned that their power came at a cost. Kael hesitated, his fingers hovering just above the relic. He could feel the storm watching him, the air crackling with anticipation. And then, driven by curiosity and the desperate hope to protect what little remained of his people, he reached out. The moment his hand made contact, the world seemed to hold its breath. The relic flared to life, and from its depths emerged a storm spirit, an ethereal being of lightning and shadow. Its voice was thunder, its gaze a tempest. It spoke of a cataclysm, a great unraveling that would consume the world if the balance of the elements was not restored. But the spirit's warning came with a choice. Kale could turn away now, leaving the relic and its secrets buried, or he could step into a storm that might destroy him before he could even begin. The skies above darkened, and the winds grew sharper, as if the world itself was waiting for his answer. Where are you joining us from, and what time is it there? As Kael stood at the edge of this fateful decision, the storm swirling around him, we invite you to join us in this tale of elemental magic, ancient secrets, and the courage it takes to face the unknown. This is not just Kael's story. It's a journey into the heart of the storm, where every choice ripples across the fabric of the world. Are you ready to step into the tempest with us? The wind howled like a wounded beast as Kael sprinted through the dense forest, his heart pounding in sync with the thunder crashing overhead. The relic, clutched tightly in his hands, pulsed with an eerie light that seemed to feed off the chaos of the storm. Behind him, shadowy figures emerged from the swirling clouds, their forms flickering like smoke caught in the gale. They moved unnaturally, as if the storm itself had given them life. Kael's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning with every step, but he pushed forward, his mind racing faster than his feet. He had never attempted to control the wind like this before, never even imagined it was possible. Yet now, with the storm raging around him and the relic's energy coursing through his veins, he could feel the air bending to his will. He thrust out his hand, and a sudden gust swept the forest floor, sending leaves and debris spiraling into the faces of his pursuers. For a moment, he thought he might escape, but the effort left him drained, his body trembling as if he'd run for miles without rest. When he finally stumbled into the shelter of a shallow cave, his legs gave out, and he collapsed against the cold stone wall. The storm's fury seemed muted here, but the relic's whispers were not. They slithered into his mind, soft and insistent, like the hiss of wind through cracks in the rock. At first, they were indistinct murmurs of a place long forgotten, a sanctuary hidden by the storm. But soon, the whispers grew louder, clearer, until they were no longer just sounds but visions. Kael's eyes fluttered shut, and suddenly he was no longer in the cave. He stood before a colossal citadel, its spires piercing the sky, wreathed in bolts of lightning that danced like living things. The air hummed with power, and he could feel it calling to him, tugging at something deep within his chest. The Relic's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to seek this place, to unlock its secrets. But as the vision faded and Kale opened his eyes, a cold knot of dread settled in his stomach. The Relic was no mere object. It was alive, or at least something close to it. And it wanted him, needed him, for reasons he couldn't yet understand. His fingers tightened around it, torn between the temptation of its power and the fear of what it might cost him. Could he trust it, or was it leading him into a trap, one that would consume him entirely? The weight of the decision pressed down on him, heavier than the storm outside. Kale knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. The shadowy figures would find him, and the Relic's whispers would only grow louder. He had to choose, and soon, whether to follow the visions to the Stormbound Sanctuary, or destroy the Relic before it destroyed him. The storm raged on, indifferent to his struggle, and Kale sat in the dim light of the cave, the Relic's glow casting long shadows on the walls. The choice was his alone. The forest grew darker as Kale pressed forward, the weight of the Relic heavy against his chest. His thoughts churned like the storm gathering overhead. Where could the sanctuary be? And who could he trust to lead him there? It was then that he heard it, a faint rustle of leaves, too deliberate to be the wind. He spun around, his hand gripping the hilt of his blade, only to meet the piercing gaze of a woman, cloaked in shades of crimson and gold. Her name was Lyra, and her smile held the kind of confidence that made Kale's instincts flare. "You're a long way from home, traveler," she said, her voice smooth, but edged with something unspoken. "And you're carrying something far more valuable than you realize." Kale's grip tightened, but before he could respond, Lyra stepped closer, her eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and ambition. "I know where the Stormbound Sanctuary lies," she continued, her tone dropping to a whisper, "and I can take you there for a price." Kale's distrust flared like a spark catching flame. He'd been burned before by promises too good to be true, yet the thought of finding the sanctuary, of unlocking the Relic's true power, was a lure he couldn't ignore. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady but wary. Lyra's lips curled into a sly grin. "A share of the Relic's power," she said, as if it were the simplest request in the world. "You need a guide, and I need, well, let's just say I have my reasons." Before Kale could respond, the air around them shifted. Shadows moved where there should have been none, and a chill crept up his spine. The ambush came without warning, dark figures emerging from the trees, their movements swift and silent. Kale's blade flashed, but it was Lyra who surprised him. With a flick of her wrist, flames erupted from her fingertips, dancing through the air like living things. The fire roared to life, engulfing their attackers and driving them back with a ferocity that left Kale momentarily stunned. For a moment, they fought side by side, their powers intertwining in a chaotic symphony of wind and flame. Kale couldn't deny the efficiency of their teamwork, but as the last of the shadowy figures retreated, his gaze fell on Lyra. Her eyes lingered on the Relic, and there was something in her expression, a hunger, sharp and unrelenting, that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't just curiosity or ambition. It was something deeper, something dangerous. and as the flames died down, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a deal with someone far more unpredictable than he'd bargained for. The Whispering Woods lived up to its name the moment Kale and Lyra stepped beneath its ancient canopy. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, but it was the faint, almost imperceptible murmurs that sent shivers down their spines. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their gnarled branches twisting as though listening, their whispers carrying fragments of forgotten histories and long-lost truths. Kale gripped the relic tighter, its faint glow pulsing in rhythm with the forest's eerie cadence. But as they ventured deeper, the relic's reaction grew more erratic. It trembled in his hands, its light flickering like a dying flame before flaring into a blinding burst. Kale staggered, his breath catching as the relic's energy surged through him. His connection to the storm, once a source of pride and control, rippled violently, slipping from his grasp. The sky above the canopy darkened, clouds churning into a tempest that roared to life with a deafening crack of thunder. Rain lashed the forest floor, and the winds howled, bending the trees as if they were mere reeds. Lyra spun to face him, her cloak whipping in the gale. "What are you doing? You're going to get us killed." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the storm's fury. Kale's jaw tightened, frustration boiling over. "I'm not doing this, it's the relic. It's reacting to something here. I can't control it." "You never think, Kale," Lyra shot back, her eyes blazing. "You just charge ahead, trusting that thing like it's some kind of savior." "What if it's not? What if it's leading us into a trap?" Before Kale could respond, the forest itself seemed to rise against them. The ground beneath their feet shifted, roots snaking upward like grasping hands. Vines slithered down from the branches, coiling around their legs, pulling them toward the earth. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the forest had awakened to claim them. "We don't have time for this," Kale shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. He thrust his hands outward, summoning a burst of wind to sever the vines. Lyra, despite her anger, didn't hesitate. She raised her hands, her own magic flaring to life as she called upon the earth to steady their footing. Together, they fought against the forest's onslaught, their movements synchronized despite the tension between them. As the chaos subsided, Kale found himself staring at the relic, its glow now subdued but still unnervingly present. Doubt crept into his mind, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Was this artifact truly guiding them, or was it manipulating them, pulling them deeper into a web of danger? The thought lingered, unsettling and unshakable, as the Whispering Woods closed in around them once more. The air inside the ancient temple was heavy, thick with the scent of damp stone and forgotten history. Kale and Lyra stepped cautiously over the cracked tiles, their footsteps echoing softly against the walls. The faint glow of Kale's lantern flickered across the carvings, illuminating scenes of a time long past. Lyra's eyes darted across the walls, her expression unreadable, while Kale lingered, tracing the intricate patterns with his fingers. Then they saw it, a sprawling mural, its colors faded but its story still vivid. The figures depicted were powerful, their forms wreathed in storm and flame. At the center stood the Stormbound, their leader, towering and radiant, surrounded by symbols of the elements. But the scene darkened toward the edges, where shadows crept in. The Stormbound's fall was etched in stark detail, a shattered relic, a sanctuary sealed, and betrayal. Kael's breath caught as he deciphered the ancient script. This relic we're searching for, it's not just a piece of the past. It's one of 4 keys, he murmured, his voice low but urgent. They're needed to unlock the sanctuary, the final resting place of the Stormbound's power. Lyra's gaze lingered on the mural, her fingers brushing over the image of the relic. Her usual calm demeanor shifted, her focus sharpening with an intensity Kale hadn't seen before. 4 keys, she repeated, almost to herself. Then we're closer than we thought. But as Kael continued to study the mural, another detail emerged, one that sent a chill through him. The script spoke of a betrayal, a trusted ally who had turned against the Stormbound, leading to their downfall. The warning was clear. History could repeat itself. Kael glanced at Lyra, her face now shadowed in the lantern's dim light. She seemed distant, lost in thought, her usual warmth replaced by something harder, colder. A knot of unease tightened in Kael's chest. Could she be the betrayer foretold in the mural? The thought felt like a betrayal of its own, but he couldn't shake it. Lyra had been so driven, so focused on the relic, but was it for the sake of their mission, or something else? He hesitated, the words hovering on the edge of his tongue, but he held them back. Now wasn't the time for accusations. Instead, he turned his attention back to the mural, committing its symbols to memory. The sanctuary, the keys, the betrayal. It was all connected, a puzzle they were only beginning to piece together. But as the lantern's light flickered again, casting long shadows across the temple walls, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that the past was closer than they realized. And perhaps so was the danger. The air grew heavy as Kael and Lyra pressed forward, the relic humming faintly at Kael's side. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual chirping of birds replaced by an eerie silence. Suddenly, shadowy figures emerged from the tree line, their movements swift and deliberate. At their forefront stood a masked mage, their presence radiating an unsettling calm. Water swirled around the mage's gloved hands, shimmering like liquid glass, ready to be shaped into a weapon. Before Kael could react, the mage struck. A whip of water lashed out, slicing through the air with a sharp hiss. Lyra raised her shield just in time, the impact sending her staggering back. Kael summoned a burst of flame, but the mage countered effortlessly, extinguishing his fire with a wall of water that rose as if commanded by the sea itself. The battle was chaotic, the clash of elements echoing through the forest. In the heat of the moment, Kael's frustration boiled over. He clutched the relic tighter, unaware of the surge of power building within it. The air crackled with energy, and then it happened. A blinding flash erupted from the relic, and the sky above them darkened in an instant. Winds howled like a chorus of fury, and rain fell in torrents, drenching the battlefield. Lightning split the heavens, striking the ground with deafening force. The storm was alive, wild, and uncontrollable, tearing through the landscape as if it had a will of its own. When the storm finally subsided, the once lush forest lay in ruins. Trees were uprooted, their branches scattered like broken bones. The Masked Mage and their shadowy allies were gone, retreating into the chaos. But before disappearing completely, the mage turned, their voice cutting through the aftermath like a blade. "This relic belongs to a power far greater than you," they declared. "You cannot hope to wield it." Kale stood frozen, his hands trembling as he stared at the destruction around him. The relic felt heavier now, its weight more than physical. Lyra approached him slowly, her expression a mix of concern and doubt. "Kale," she began, her voice steady but tinged with unease. "That power, it's not just dangerous. It's uncontrollable. What if it consumes you?" Kale didn't have an answer. The storm had been a glimpse of the relic's true potential, and it terrified him. He had always believed the relic could be a tool for good, but now he wasn't so sure. The Masked Mage's words echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder that there were forces at play far beyond his understanding. As they surveyed the wreckage, a quiet tension settled between them. Lyra's faith in their mission wavered, her trust in Kale's ability to harness the relic's power shaken to its core. For the first time, the path ahead seemed uncertain, and the weight of their journey pressed heavier than ever. The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered, a grim reminder of the challenges yet to come. The salty breeze carried the scent of the ocean as Kale and Lyra stumbled into the small coastal village, their weary steps sinking into the sand. The village was a patchwork of weathered wooden huts and fishing nets, draped like spider webs under the setting sun. It was here, in the shadow of a creaking dock, that they found the old sailor. His face was a map of wrinkles, each line etched by years of wind and waves. He sat on an overturned barrel, mending a net with hands that moved as if they still remembered the rhythm of the sea. When Lyra approached him, her voice soft but insistent, the sailor's eyes lit up with a strange mix of recognition and caution. "You're after the relic, aren't you?" he said, his voice gravelly but sharp. "The one in the sunken temple." Kale's eyes widened, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. The sailor leaned in, his gaze darting to the horizon, as if the sea itself might overhear. "I've seen it," he muttered, "but the temple's not unguarded. There's a serpent, an ancient beast with scales like blackened iron and eyes that glow like embers. It doesn't take kindly to intruders." Kale's jaw tightened, his fingers brushing the hilt of his sword. "We'll take our chances," he said, his voice steady but edged with a desperation Lyra couldn't ignore. She glanced at him, her brows knitting together. The relic's whispers had been growing louder, more insistent, and she could see how they were clawing at Kale's mind. His determination was no longer just about their mission. It was something darker, something consuming. "Kale," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't like the other relics. The sailor's warning, we can't just rush in. We need a plan." But Kale's eyes were distant, fixed on some unseen point beyond the horizon. "We don't have time for plans," he replied sharply. "Every moment we waste, the relic slips further from our grasp." Lyra hesitated, her unease growing with every word. She wanted to argue, to remind him of the dangers they'd already faced, but the look in his eyes silenced her. Reluctantly, she nodded, though her stomach churned with doubt. As they prepared for the journey, gathering supplies and charting a course to the sunken temple, Kale's restlessness grew. The relic's whispers were no longer just a faint hum in the back of his mind. They were a constant, gnawing presence, urging him forward, faster. He could feel it, like a thread pulling him toward the depths of the ocean, and the thought of delaying even a moment longer filled him with a strange, almost unbearable tension. Lyra watched him from the corner of her eye, her own thoughts a storm of worry and suspicion. She couldn't shake the feeling that this relic was different, that it wasn't just a tool, it was a test. And Kale, driven by its whispers, was walking a dangerous line. The old sailor watched them from the shore as they set out in a borrowed fishing boat, his expression unreadable. "The sea doesn't forgive fools," he called after them, his voice carrying on the wind. Lyra glanced back, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. Ahead, the ocean stretched endlessly, its surface shimmering like liquid glass under the moonlight. Beneath it, somewhere in the dark depths, the sunken temple waited, and with it, the relic that might either save them or unravel everything they'd fought for. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, its depths a swirling, in-kai abyss that seemed to swallow all light. Kael and Lyra plunged into the cold embrace of the water, their elemental powers flickering faintly in the oppressive darkness. Kael's wind magic, once so reliable on land, sputtered and failed as the currents pressed in from all sides. He struggled to maintain his composure, the weight of the water heavy on his chest, his breath growing shallow. Lyra, however, moved with a determined grace, her fire magic glowing faintly in her palms. She glanced back at Kale, her eyes sharp with urgency, and gestured for him to follow. The deeper they went, the more the pressure mounted, both physical and emotional. Kale's frustration grew as he realized how powerless he was in this realm. He had always been the one to lead, to protect, but here he was adrift literally and figuratively. Lyra, sensing his unease, paused for a moment, her hand brushing his arm in a silent reassurance. Then, without warning, the water around them shifted. A low, rumbling vibration echoed through the depths, sending shivers down their spines. From the shadows emerged the Sea Serpent, its massive form coiling through the water like a living storm. Its scales shimmered with an otherworldly glow, each one etched with ancient runes that pulsed faintly with magic. The creature's eyes locked onto them, cold and calculating, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Kale instinctively reached for his wind magic, but the currents only swirled uselessly around him. Lyra acted quickly, her fire magic flaring to life. She conjured a sphere of flame, creating a fragile air pocket around them. The heat was intense, even underwater, and the effort left her gasping. Kale watched in awe as the flames danced, holding back the crushing weight of the ocean. But the strain was evident. Lyra's hands trembled, her face pale as she fought to maintain the spell. Kale's heart pounded as he realized the truth. He couldn't do this alone. His pride, his trust in his own abilities, had blinded him to the reality of their situation. As the Sea Serpent circled closer, its massive jaws parting to reveal rows of jagged teeth, Kale made a choice. He reached out, placing a hand on Lyra's shoulder, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I trust you," he said, the words heavy with meaning. "Lead the way." Lyra's eyes met his, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. She nodded, her resolve hardening as she turned back to face the serpent. Together, they would face this ancient beast, not as rivals, but as partners. The water around them seemed to hold its breath as Lyra's fire burned brighter. illuminating the depths and casting long shadows across the serpent's form. Kale, though out of his element, stood ready, his trust in Lyra's strength now unshakable. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, they truly understood what it meant to fight as one. The air inside the sunken temple was thick with the scent of ancient stone, and the faint metallic tang of magic lingering in the shadows. Kael and Lyra stepped cautiously into the first chamber, their footsteps echoing against the walls as the heavy doors sealed shut behind them. Before them stretched a vast pool of dark, rippling water, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly glow. This was no ordinary trial. It was a test of balance, patience, and control, all qualities the temple demanded of those who sought its secrets. Kale hesitated at the edge, his confidence faltering as the water seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He stepped forward, the relic in his hand humming faintly, but the moment his foot touched the surface, the water surged, wrapping around him like a living force. Panic set in as the current dragged him under, his movements growing frantic as the weight of the water pressed against his chest. Lyra acted without hesitation, diving in after him. Her connection to the element allowed her to move effortlessly through the depths, and with a burst of energy, she pulled him to the surface. Coughing and gasping, Kale clung to the edge, his pride wounded, but his resolve unshaken. The next trial awaited them in a chamber, bathed in flickering orange light. Flames danced along the walls, their heat intense enough to make the air shimmer. Kale stepped forward, the relic glowing brighter in his hand, as if sensing the challenge. This time, it was his turn to lead. He raised the artifact, feeling its energy surge through him, and with a focused breath, he willed the flames to subside. The fire retreated, curling back into the stone as if it had never been there. But the effort left Kale pale and trembling, his strength visibly sapped. Lyra watched him closely, her brow furrowed. "Kale," she said, her voice low but urgent. "This isn't right. The relic. It's not just using your energy. It's taking something from you." Kale shook his head, his voice steady but strained. "It's the price of power, Lyra. I can handle it. We're so close, I can feel it." Her concern deepened, but she said nothing more. The sanctuary was within reach, and Kale's determination burned brighter than ever, even as the relic's glow seemed to dim slightly with each passing moment. Together, they pressed on, the weight of the trials and the temple's ancient secrets pressing down on them both. The next chamber loomed ahead, its entrance shrouded in darkness, promising yet another challenge that would test not only their abilities, but the very bond they relied on to survive. The air inside the temple grew heavy, thick with the scent of salt and ancient stone. Kale and Lyra stood before the second relic, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly glow. It pulsed faintly, as though alive, and the moment Kale's fingers closed around it, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. Dust rained from the ceiling, and cracks spider-webbed across the walls. The relic's power had awakened something far below, something immense and furious. The temple groaned as if in agony, its age-old foundations crumbling under the weight of its own history. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos. "We need to move now," she shouted, grabbing Kale's arm and pulling him toward the exit. The corridor ahead was already collapsing, chunks of stone crashing down around them. Their footsteps echoed wildly as they sprinted through the labyrinthine halls, the sound of rushing water growing louder with every step. Behind them, a low, guttural roar reverberated through the temple, shaking the very air. The Sea Serpent had awakened. They burst into the open air just as the temple's entrance collapsed behind them, the sound of stone meeting stone like a thunderclap. But their relief was short-lived. The water around the temple churned violently, frothing and boiling as something massive rose from the depths. The serpent's head breached the surface, its scales glistening like polished obsidian, its eyes burning with ancient malice. It lunged toward them, jaws wide enough to swallow them whole. Kale acted on instinct. He gripped both relics tightly, their combined energy surging through him like a wildfire. The sky darkened almost instantly, clouds swirling into a tempest. Lightning split the heavens, and the wind howled as though the storm itself were alive. Kale raised his arms, and the storm answered. A bolt of lightning struck the serpent, driving it back into the depths with a deafening roar. The waves calmed, the sky cleared, and for a moment, it seemed as though they had won. But the victory was fleeting. Kale's legs buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, his body trembling uncontrollably. The relics fell from his hands, their glow fading. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. The power had been too much for him to contain. Lyra knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. "You fool," she muttered, though there was more fear than anger in her voice. "Always pushing yourself too far." With a frustrated sigh, she slung his arm over her shoulders and began the slow, arduous journey back to safety. Her mind raced with a mix of worry and irritation. Kale's recklessness had saved them, but at what cost? She couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing with forces far beyond their understanding. The relics were powerful, yes, but they were also dangerous, more dangerous than Kale seemed willing to admit. As she carried him through the dense forest, her frustration simmered, a quiet storm of its own. They had survived, but the battle had left her with more questions than answers. What were the relics truly capable of, and how much more could Kale endure before his body gave out entirely? The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They couldn't afford to underestimate the forces they were up against. The relics were a double-edged sword, and every victory came with a price. Kale's eyes fluttered open to the soft glow of a hearth fire, the scent of herbs and earth filling the air. He found himself in a small, rustic hut, the walls lined with woven tapestries and shelves of dried plants. Outside, the chatter of villagers carried on the wind, their voices tinged with unease. A kind-faced woman with weathered hands approached, offering him a steaming cup of tea. "You've been asleep for a day and a half," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "The storm brought you here, but it seems the storm within you is far from over." The villagers gathered around, their faces shadowed with concern. They spoke in hushed tones of a creeping darkness, a blight that had begun to wither crops and poison streams. "It's as if the land itself is being drained," one elder murmured, his voice trembling. "There are whispers of a relic hidden deep within the volcanic mountain to the east." The fire-worshipping mages guard it fiercely, but some say it holds the power to restore balance, or destroy it entirely. Lyra, who had been sitting quietly by the fire, stood abruptly, her eyes blazing. "Kale, you can't be serious about chasing after another relic. Look at you. You're barely standing. This isn't just about you anymore." Her voice cracked with frustration, and for a moment, the room fell silent. Kale met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "I don't have a choice," he said quietly. "If this relic can stop what's happening, I have to try." The tension between them crackled like a live wire. Lyra stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. "You're not invincible, Kale. If you keep pushing yourself like this, you're going to get us both killed. I won't stand by and watch you throw your life away." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Kale looked away, his hands clenching into fists. "And what am I supposed to do?" he shot back. "Sit here and wait for the world to burn." The argument spilled into the night, their voices rising and falling like the wind outside. Finally, Lyra crossed her arms, her expression resolute. "If you won't listen to reason, then I'm done. I can't keep watching you destroy yourself for some impossible quest." Her words struck Kale like a blow, and for the first time he faltered. He sank onto a wooden bench, his shoulders slumping. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll rest." But not for long. As the fire burned low, Kale lay awake, the whispers of the relic echoing in his mind. They were louder now, more insistent, urging him forward. The mountain loomed in his thoughts, its fiery peak a beacon he couldn't ignore. He glanced at Lyra, who sat by the window, her silhouette framed by moonlight. She was right. He was pushing too hard, but the relic's call was relentless, a siren song that wouldn't let him rest. In the quiet of the night, he wondered if he was chasing salvation or his own destruction. The air grew thick with the scent of sulfur as Kael and Lyra approached the volcanic mountain, its jagged peak spewing plumes of smoke into the crimson sky. The ground beneath their feet was hot to the touch, the earth itself seeming to pulse with a life of its own. It wasn't long before they were surrounded silent figures, cloaked in robes of deep red and gold, emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing like embers. These were the fire-worshipping mages, guardians of the mountain, and they moved with a precision that left no room for escape. Their leader, a woman whose presence burned as fiercely as the flames she commanded, stepped forward. Ember, as she was called, regarded them with a gaze that could melt stone. "You trespass on sacred ground," she said, her voice low and crackling like a wildfire. "If you wish to leave, you must prove your worth. Survive the trial by fire, and you may walk free. Fail, and you will become ash." The trial was as brutal as it sounded. They were led to a cavern deep within the mountain, where rivers of molten lava flowed like veins through the rock. The heat was suffocating, the air shimmering with distortion. Kale felt the relics at his side hum in response, their power shielding him from the worst of the inferno. But Lyra, despite her mastery of fire magic, began to falter. The intensity of the trial was unlike anything she had faced before, and her spells flickered and died in the oppressive heat. Her confidence wavered, and for the first time, she felt truly vulnerable. Kael, sensing her struggle, acted without hesitation. Drawing on the relic's energy, he extended his protection to her, shielding her from the flames. It was an instinctive act, born of loyalty and care, but it came at a cost. Lyra's pride shattered. She had always been the stronger mage, the one who protected him. To be rescued by Kael, of all people, felt like a betrayal of everything she believed about herself. "I didn't need your help," she muttered, her voice brittle with shame. The tension between them grew heavier than the mountain itself. Kale wanted to reassure her, to explain that he hadn't meant to undermine her, but the words caught in his throat. He could see the hurt in her eyes, the frustration of being seen as weak, and though they had survived the trial, the rift between them deepened, leaving them both wondering if their bond could withstand the flames that had tested them. The mountain had spared their lives, but at what cost? The air grew thick with tension as Ember's words hung in the space between them. "The third relic," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of centuries, "lies hidden in the heart of the volcano. But it is not a place for the unprepared. Only those who can command all four elements, earth, water, fire, and air, can hope to reach it." Kale's breath caught in his chest. He had come so far, mastering fire and air, but the thought of controlling earth and water felt like standing at the base of an insurmountable mountain. His hands clenched at his sides, a mix of determination and doubt swirling within him. He knew there was no turning back now. The relic was the key to everything, and he couldn't let his lack of mastery stop him. Ember stepped closer, her fiery gaze locking onto his. "If you truly wish to succeed, you must learn to wield the elements you've yet to conquer. Earth and water are not like fire and air. They demand patience, balance, and humility. Are you ready to face that challenge?" Kale nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at the edges of his resolve. He had no choice but to try. Ember's offer to train him was a lifeline, but her warning rang clear. This would not be easy. The path ahead would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As the days turned into weeks, Kale threw himself into the training, his every waking moment consumed by the relentless pursuit of mastery. Ember was a harsh teacher, pushing him to his physical and mental limits. She demanded precision, focus, and an unshakable will. Kale's muscles ached, his mind weary from the constant strain, but he refused to give up. Each failure brought him closer to understanding the elements, and each small victory fueled his determination. Yet as Kale's powers grew, a shadow began to creep into the group. Lyra, once his closest ally, watched from the sidelines, her expression growing colder with each passing day. She had always been the one to guide him, to share in the journey, but now she felt invisible, her contributions overshadowed by Kale's rapid progress. The bonds of trust that had once held them together began to fray. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lyra stood alone at the edge of the training grounds, her gaze fixed on the distant volcano. The flicker of resentment in her heart had grown into a burning flame. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being left behind, her role reduced to that of a spectator. The relics were meant to be a shared victory, but now it seemed Kale was destined to claim them alone. A plan began to form in her mind, one born of frustration and ambition. If Kale could master the elements, why couldn't she? The relics were not his alone to claim. They were a prize for the worthy, and Lyra intended to prove her worth. She would find her own path, one that didn't rely on Kale's growing strength or Ember's guidance. The volcano's heart might hold the third relic, but Lyra was determined to reach it first. As the firelight danced across her face, Lyra's resolve hardened. The journey ahead would be perilous, but she was willing to risk everything. The relics were too powerful, too important. to be left in someone else's hands. And if that meant walking a path alone, so be it. The storm was coming, and Lyra would be ready. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and the distant rumble of the earth as Kael finally grasped the third relic, its surface warm and pulsing with ancient energy. He had endured weeks of grueling trials, mastering fire and forging his will into something unbreakable. Yet as the relic settled into his hand, the ground beneath him trembled violently. The volcano, dormant for centuries, roared to life, its peak spewing ash and molten rock into the sky. Kael's triumph was short-lived. The mountain itself seemed to rebel against the relic's removal, as if it had been the keystone holding the land together. Ember, ever the protector, stepped forward. Her eyes met Kael's, and in that moment, he knew what she was about to do. "Go," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I'll hold it back." Before he could protest, she unleashed a torrent of flame, creating a barrier between them and the advancing eruption. Kael hesitated, his heart torn between loyalty and survival. But Ember's resolve was unshakable. "This isn't the end," she said, a faint smile breaking through. "But you have to go, now." The heat grew unbearable as Kael and Lyra fled, the ground cracking beneath their feet. Kael's mind raced with guilt, the weight of Ember's sacrifice pressing heavily on his chest. He glanced back, catching a final glimpse of her silhouette, wet engulfed in fire and smoke. It was a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his days, but there was no time to mourn. The volcano's fury was relentless, and every second counted. As they reached a precarious ridge, Lyra suddenly stopped. Her expression shifted, the mask of camaraderie slipping away. Before Kael could react, she snatched the relics from his grasp, her movements swift and precise. "Thank you for your help," she said, her voice cold and mocking. "But these belong to me now." Kael's heart sank as the truth hit him. Lyra had played him from the start, her true intentions hidden behind a veil of friendship. She had used him to gather the relics, and now she held all three. The ground shook violently, a river of lava carving through the landscape below. Kael's anger flared, but there was no time to confront her. The eruption forced them apart, the mountain's wrath scattering them like leaves in a storm. Kael found himself running alone, his mind a whirlwind of grief, betrayal, and determination. Ember was gone, the relics were in Lyra's hands, and the world teetered on the brink of catastrophe. But Kael wasn't defeated, not yet. As he stumbled through the ash-filled air, a fire of his own ignited within him. He vowed to stop Lyra, to reclaim the relics, and to prevent her from unleashing their devastating power. The journey ahead would be perilous, and the cost had already been too high. But Kael knew one thing for certain: he couldn't fail. The fate of the world depended on him, and he would see this through, no matter the cost. The wind howled across the barren expanse, carrying with it the faint scent of ash and decay. Kael's boots crunched against the cracked earth as he pressed forward, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Lyra. She stood at the heart of the desolate wasteland, her hands gripping the three relics, ancient artifacts pulsating with an eerie, otherworldly glow. The air around her seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of their power. He could feel it, even from a distance, a low, resonant hum that set his teeth on edge. She was close, so close to unlocking the sanctuary, and yet something felt deeply wrong. Before he could call out to her, shadows erupted from the ground, swirling and coalescing into figures cloaked in darkness. Their leader stepped forward, the Masked Mage, her face obscured by a veil of shifting smoke. Lyra froze, her expression flickering between shock and recognition. The mage's voice cut through the silence, cold and familiar. "Did you truly believe you could outrun your past, Lyra?" she taunted, her words dripping with venom. "You were always my greatest student, but even you cannot escape what you've become." Lyra's hands trembled, the relics glowing brighter in her grasp. Her voice, when it came, was a mixture of defiance and pain. "You don't understand. This isn't about you. It's about ending this, all of it." The Masked Mage laughed, a hollow sound that echoed across the wasteland. "And yet, here you are, wielding the very power you swore to destroy. How poetic." In that moment, something shifted in Lyra. Her eyes, once filled with determination, now burned with a darker intensity. With a swift, almost violent motion, she raised the relics, their energy surging like a storm. The Masked Mage barely had time to react before a blinding light erupted, engulfing her in a searing cascade of power. When the light faded, she was gone, her form disintegrated into nothingness, but the victory came at a cost. Lyra staggered, her breath ragged, her hands now stained with the relic's corruption. The once bright energy swirling around her had turned dark, twisting like tendrils of shadow. Kale's heart pounded as he stepped closer, his voice trembling with urgency. "Lyra, stop. This isn't you. The relics, they're changing you. Can't you feel it?" She turned to him, her eyes hollow, her voice eerily calm. "I feel everything, Kale. The power, the pain, the truth. This is the only way." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers. "There's always another way. Please, don't do this." But she shook her head, the relic's dark energy surging around her like a storm. "You don't understand. No one does, not even you." The air grew heavier, the ground trembling beneath their feet as the relic's power continued to consume her. Kale stood frozen, torn between his duty and the fear of what she was becoming. The woman he once knew was slipping away, her soul twisted by the very forces she had sought to control. And as the shadows closed in, he realized the battle ahead would not be against the relics, but against the darkness they had unleashed within her. The air crackled with energy as Kale and Lyra faced each other, their elemental powers swirling like a tempest. Flames roared from Kale's hands, meeting the howling winds and jagged bolts of lightning Lyra summoned. The ground beneath them trembled, and the sky above darkened as their forces collided in a blinding spectacle of raw power. Kale's voice rose above the chaos, pleading with Lyra to stop, to remember who she was. But her eyes, once full of warmth and determination, now glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. The relics had taken hold, twisting her mind into something unrecognizable. Kale knew he was running out of time. With every passing moment, Lyra's attacks grew more furious, more destructive. The sanctuary around them, a place once sacred and serene, was crumbling under the weight of their battle. He could feel the relic's power surging through him, but also their corruption. A dark whisper urging him to give in, to let go of restraint. He realized then what he had to do. It wasn't just about stopping Lyra. It was about ending the cycle of destruction the relics had caused. In a final, desperate act, Kale reached deep within himself, severing his connection to the relics. The pain was immediate, a searing emptiness where once there had been boundless energy. But with the last vestiges of their power, he channeled everything into the sanctuary's ancient seals. The ground erupted in a blinding flash of light as the sanctuary's walls surged upward, encasing Lyra within an impenetrable barrier. Her cries of rage echoed through the air, but they grew fainter, muffled by the magic now locking her away. Kael collapsed to his knees, his strength completely drained. The relics, once a source of unimaginable power, now lay dormant, their energy spent. He was powerless, but the world was safe. For now. As the storm subsided and the sky cleared, Kael looked up at the sanctuary, now a silent tomb. He had lost so much, his connection to the elements, his closest ally, and the future he had hoped to build. Yet in that moment, he felt a strange sense of peace. Some battles weren't meant to be won with strength alone, but with sacrifice. And though the cost was great, the world would live to see another dawn. Kale trudged back to his village, his once proud stride now heavy with the weight of exhaustion and regret. The skies above were calm, no longer churning with the fury of storms, but the land beneath his feet told a different story. Fields that once bloomed with life now lay scorched and barren, their scars a silent testament to the battles that had raged here. The air, though still, carried the faint scent of ash, a lingering reminder of the chaos he had fought to end. As he approached the outskirts of the village, a crowd began to gather. Faces he had known since childhood, faces that had once looked to him with hope, now gazed upon him with something far heavier, reverence. They called him a hero, their voices rising in a chorus of gratitude and awe. But the words fell on Kael like a cold rain, chilling him to his core. Hero. He felt no pride, no triumph, only sorrow for Lyra, whose light had been extinguished too soon. Sorrow for the power he had lost, not because he missed it, but because it had cost him everything. In the quiet of the night, when the villagers had returned to their homes, Kael took the relics, the very objects that had once pulsed with unimaginable energy, and carried them to the edge of the forest. There, beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, he dug a grave for them. The earth swallowed them whole, and with it, Kael's final connection to the life he had once known. He spoke no words as he worked, but his heart made a vow. Never again would these relics see the light of day. Never again would their power be unleashed upon the world. Yet as he turned to leave, the wind shifted. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A whisper carried on the breeze. Kael froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was soft, insidious, like a thread of smoke curling through his thoughts. It spoke no words he could understand, but its meaning was clear. The relics were not gone. Their power lingered, restless, waiting, and though Kael had buried them deep, he couldn't shake the feeling that the earth itself might one day betray him. The years had passed like whispers on the wind, each one carrying a weight Kael could never quite shed. He lived now in the quiet embrace of solitude, far from the echoes of his past. Yet, no matter how far he wandered, the memories clung to him like shadows. Lyra's voice, the sanctuary's crumbling walls, the storm that had changed everything. He had tried to bury it all, to let time erase the scars, but some wounds never truly heal. And then, one night, the horizon darkened. The air grew heavy, charged with a tension Kael hadn't felt in years. A storm was brewing, but this was no ordinary tempest. The clouds churned with an unnatural fury, their edges glowing faintly, as though lit from within. And then, faint at first but growing louder, came the whispers. They were sharper now, more urgent, threading through the wind like a summons he couldn't ignore. Kael's heart clenched as he recognized the voice Lyra. Her spirit, long bound to the sanctuary's seal, was calling to him. The seal was weakening, and with it, the ancient storm's power threatened to break free once more. For a moment, Kael hesitated. The thought of facing that storm again, of reliving the choices that had cost him so much, was almost too much to bear. He had spent years running from it, from her, but as the whispers grew louder, he knew there was no escaping this. The world teetered on the edge of chaos, and the weight of his past actions pressed down on him like the storm itself. He could turn away, let the storm take its course, and let others bear the consequences, or he could face it, knowing full well this might be the end of him. Kael clenched his fists, feeling the old magic stir within him, faint but still alive. He had once been a stormbreaker, a guardian of the elements. That part of him had never truly died, no matter how much he had tried to bury it. Drawing a deep breath, he stepped forward, his resolve hardening with each step. The storm would not win, not this time. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, but Kael moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. The whispers guided him, Lyra's voice a beacon in the chaos. He would face the storm, and whatever lay beyond it, one last time. Kael stood at the threshold of the sanctuary, the air thick with the weight of centuries. The relics pulsed faintly, their light flickering like dying embers, and within their glow he saw her, Lyra. Her spirit, once radiant and fierce, now flickered like a shadow, bound to the very artifacts she had sought to control. Her voice, soft and trembling, reached out to him. "Kael, I never meant for this. Please, forgive me." The words hung heavy in the air, but Kael's resolve did not waver. He knew what had to be done, to break the cycle, to end the storms that had ravaged the land for generations. The relics had to be destroyed, even if it meant losing Lyra forever. His hands trembled as he reached for the relics, each step forward a battle against the storm's howling winds and his own exhaustion. With a surge of energy, Kael channeled the last remnants of his elemental power. The relics glowed brighter, resisting, as if they knew their end was near. Lyra's spirit cried out, her form flickering wildly, but Kael pressed on. "This is the only way," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. A blinding flash erupted as the relics shattered, their fragments scattering like stars across the sanctuary. Lyra's spirit surged upward, free at last, her form dissolving into a cascade of light that spiraled into the heavens. The storm, once deafening, began to quiet. The wind softened, the thunder faded, and the sanctuary itself seemed to sigh in relief. Kael sank to his knees, the weight of his journey finally catching up to him. His body, battered and broken, could no longer hold him upright. As he fell, a strange calm washed over him. The world was safe. The storms had ended. And though his story might fade into legend, the tales of the Stormbound would live on, whispered by the winds, carried across the ages. the sanctuary sealed itself, its entrance vanishing into the earth as if it had never been. Kael's eyes closed, his breath slowing, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt at peace. The legacy of the Stormbound was not just one of destruction. It was a story of sacrifice, of hope, and of the unyielding spirit of those who dared to stand against the tempest. And as the winds swept across the land, they carried with them the echoes of Kael's courage, a reminder that even in the darkest storms, light could still be found.